and we're joined by Holly Brideges, author of the book Reframe Your Thinking Around Autism. So Holly, what are we talking about in today's session?
In today's session, we're looking at resilience and how emotional and psychological resilience requires physiological resilience and what that means, and just how much our flight or fight system determines how much we can access brain function and social engagement function.
To put it simply, the key difference is that autism is a condition you're born with. Our brains are literally wired differently, whereas trauma is something that happens to you, an event or series of events that has a lasting impact, best understood as a kind of psychological injury that can be healed over time.
And I think that's the beauty of it. And there's a simplicity to this, and there's a simplicity to the work that we miss because we go down, there's this massive brain pathology thing going on when maybe there isn't. Maybe there's an exquisitely new evolutionary brain happening. Who knows? We actually don't know what autism is. So the polyvagal theory is the body has a learnt response to pain and fear and can go into an involuntary shutdown as a safety mechanism. Valenza, can you give me a nod when I'm 5 minutes up, please? So within that safety mechanism, we have a sliding scale of safety options. And all mammals have these safety options. So in this sense, we're no different from the lions and the tigers and the bears. We all have a physical system that allows us to engage in being in the world. So our social engagement system is our newest evolutionary function. And as I said, all mammals have this system. We just then employ it with a, fairly upgraded brain in terms of executive functioning, etc. In order to be able to use your social engagement system, which is your connection to your eyes, ears, face, voice, and heart, you have to be in a good enough physiological place. You have to be kind of calm enough. Your tummy has to be regulated. Your heart rate needs to be down. There's all sorts of ways in which your neurosensory systems have to be nice and even, and you're in a parasympathetic enough state, and then you have a really good connection like software to your social capacity. When you go into a flight or fight state, so maybe there's a lion way off in the distance, your body responds, it notifies you that there's something going on, and then your brain kicks in and goes, well, I know what that is, and then you are aware enough, on the whole, for making some decisions to flight, fight, or freeze, kind of stop still. And here we're in kind of a sympathetic state, and most of us go through our whole day like this, and we can forget to ever be in a really calm place. Excuse me. So we go into this fight thing, and it's mostly voluntary, and we can kind of stay there. There's also another option, and this is what Porges is saying with his theory, which is brilliant, and it's actually nothing new, we've just forgotten, that the body has a capacity to immobilize. So at this point, the body takes over. If it deems that lion is getting too close for you to make any responsible decision on what's going to make you safe, it will drop you out like a rabbit in a headlight. It will take you out, and you cannot use your voice, your face, move your body, etc. at a certain point, and you literally just have to wait until it wakes up again. Because if that lion gets really close and you blink or you murmur or you move your head or leg or twitch, you're interesting to the lion, and then it suddenly becomes a different state of play. Whereas your best opportunity is if the lion's not particularly hungry, it will go away. And so it's your body's last strategy for survival, and often it works. We're not supposed to really employ it very often, and in this day and age we don't deal with lions, so we don't really even think this happens. But the theory with the polyvagal theory and with autism is that the physical system is a lot more trigger happy, and people sort of more hang out in the flight or fight freeze state or in the immobilized state, but they're generally sort of milling around that area, and they don't have a really good understanding of what it is to be in a body that's really nicely connected and calm with an open tummy, etc. And so they're at the mercy of this physical system. And that's what people say. They say, I'm in a body that doesn't work for me. I can't control myself. I hate getting really angry. I hate not knowing what I said. But they can't control it because they've gone into a disassociated state. And that's what this is. So what we're doing with my work is teaching the body to be more robust, to have another gear on the bike, which is what one client explained it as, so that there's more choice. And the choice isn't particularly intellectual. If the body can learn how to do this, it just doesn't immobilize as much because it's got another option and it's got a level of robustness at a vagus nerve level. So the vagus nerve is one of the 12 cranial nerves, and all the speechies and OTs learn this in first year uni. But as one speechy I know really well said, we learnt all of this, no one ever put it together like this though. And it's that, this is just a tiny little jump somewhere else and it makes all the difference. So I'm going to go through all of these because when you actually look at them, it really, really makes sense of autism. The cranial nerves are olfactory, smell and taste. So when you're in a flight or fight state, that smell and taste goes down. So it makes really good sense of why people have food aversions and they need things to be just so. There are so many people that, can only eat chips. It's not that they're being willful, it's that their body literally can't take that anything else much in. And then it becomes very circular. So we try and take it out of that circular thing with cognitive stuff. But what I'm finding is if you get the body in a better place, things just naturally open up. The optic nerve does vision, brightness, contrast, light reflex. If you can't even see that food properly or the peas on your plate, you can't want to put it in your body as well. But you also, 5 of these are eyes, as you can see. And so we say people on the spectrum can't make good eye contact. If your eyes are quite fixed, which they are if you've got a lion coming towards you, you don't want to be looking around at flowers at that point and digesting food. You want to be fixated on that lion. So the eyes go really straight ahead and they're more tunnel vision, and then that informs our brain and we can get very tunnel vision with things. And what I see when I start working with people, gently, kindly, and in no way in a hurry to take them anywhere in particular because it's very, very delicate work, they will get peripheral vision. They will go and stare at a tree for ages, a 5-year-old or a 10-year-old or a 20-year-old, and it's like they're seeing it for the first time because their senses are coming online in a way that they haven't been available to them before. The facial nerve does taste, ears, facial expressions. And this is one people really focus on with the polyvagal theory because of the auditory sensitivities and the lack of facial expression, which was very much a thing I dealt with when I was younger. And, my face still really does turn off if I'm tired. It just does. Vestibular cochlear, hearing and balance. People often have huge issues with this. Taste, glossopharyngeal, information to the brain about tongues, tonsils and swallowing. Again, it just makes food really, really difficult if your body's not in the right place for it. The vagus does the sensory, motor and autonomic functions, glands, digestion, heart rate. And so it actually organizes the body, connected to all sorts of other things. This is a very, very simplistic model of what's going on because it's enough for what we need to understand. So when I say the vagus controls it, allow me some leeway. It will take you into a flight or fight state and it will immobilize you. And when it's in the right place, you have access to your social engagement system and a nice, easy digestion and a good heart rate, etc. So it's highly influential and it controls all of these other things because it will turn them all down from 10 till 1 if that lion gets too close. And we just are very beholden to our bodies in this way, in a way that we don't really get taught and understand anymore. I think we used to know this a whole lot better, but we've pathologized so many things and got out of an orientation of understanding just what an embodied state is, because we love the mind and we love being in charge, and people who can control themselves are great and people who can't are not. Tongue, speech, swallowing. If you think about having stage fright, being somewhere where you're anxious, you can't use your voice. You get tongue-tied. It turns off, and then you have to work within that particular physical choreography. So all we're doing with my work is gently, softly, and very respectfully helping the person come out into a more simple and comfortable physical choreography. The vagus nerve is a bidirectional bus route. It takes information from the body up to the brain. It is in all the major organs of the body, and it goes up to the brain stem, and it influences so many things. What people often do is do vagus nerve hacking, where you get your vagus nerve back into shape and get it back so you can get back to work as quickly as possible, or we need to do this so we can make people more socially engaged. And I find all of that quite frightening, because all of those states are there for a reason. And if you've got someone in a high trauma state, or they've never understood a more softer state, you don't want to snap them back anywhere. What we're trying to do is get them to have a greater level of body awareness in their own way. And we're very, very cautious about all the work we do. So my work looks very simple, and people will run off and go, oh, I'm going to go and run a workshop on this, and they do. And I hear reports sometimes of things that happen where people have got very uncomfortable because your body's put a defense in place for a reason. So we have to be very, very mindful, though, although this is simple, it's also highly individual, and you have to be really, really thoughtful.
Autism is a pervasive, lifelong neurodevelopmental condition, and what that essentially means is that our brains develop differently, and that affects everything. It means that we have a variety of preferences and behaviours that are unusual, to say the least, and this results in, most notably, challenges in social communication and interaction, among other things. What we usually refer to as trauma or PTSD are symptoms that arise from an incident that overwhelms a person's ability to cope. According to the book Principles of Trauma Therapy, an event is traumatic if it is extremely upsetting, at least temporarily overwhelms an individual's internal resources, and produces lasting psychological symptoms. To get some clarity around this, I asked autistic clinical psychologist Steve Braun, who regularly works with both autism and trauma, if there is an easy yet accurate way for us to understand this. Steve told me that in research and clinical practice, there's a helpful distinction between simple trauma and complex trauma, with the complex type being more relevant to autism. Simple trauma is when the person experienced a single distressing event, like a car crash, and complex trauma is where the person experienced multiple negative events over a long time, for example, growing up in an abusive or neglectful home situation. In terms of diagnosis, someone who continues to be distressed by a traumatic experience and finds it hard to move on may qualify for a DSM-5 diagnosis like PTSD. Here's what the World Health Organization has to say on the matter. Complex PTSD is characterized by severe and persistent problems in affect regulation, beliefs about oneself as diminished, defeated, or worthless, accompanied by feelings of shame, guilt, or failure related to the traumatic event, and difficulties in sustaining relationships and feeling close to others. These symptoms cause significant impairment in social, family, educational, occupational, or other important areas of functioning. Wow, when I read this, the first thing I think of is that for many people, these three things basically define the autistic experience. Problems regulating your emotions, believing that you're broken, an endless chain of broken relationships. Autism and trauma are two very different things, but to help us start to pull them apart, let's look at the ways in which they're similar. First off, both experience social difficulties. Our different life experiences make it difficult to relate and communicate with others, leading us to feel out of step with normal people. They sometimes call Asperger's wrong planet syndrome, and at times it literally feels like we must be aliens stuck in a world full of these strange little humans. How are we supposed to relate to our peers? As a result, we may isolate ourselves or avoid social interactions due to experiences of stigma, misunderstanding, or judgment from others. Both struggle with feeling overwhelmed and difficulty regulating emotions in general, often accompanied by high daily anxiety levels. Ask any parent and they'll tell you about autistic outbursts that seem to come from nowhere. Sometimes our sudden emotions are a surprise to us too. Self-soothing stims are part of normal human behaviour that people try to do to calm themselves down when they feel anxious. In the case of autistic stimming, this may also be a way of releasing energy or maybe even a sensory behaviour. If the world is not safe, then seeking certainty and insisting on routine can be a way to try and manage anxiety. We have sensory and cognitive differences, so instead of avoiding distressing reminders of a traumatic event, the autistic person may be avoiding unpleasant sensory situations or tasks that are cognitively difficult or draining or anxiety-producing. We can manage triggers that could otherwise overwhelm us by, for example, staying home and avoiding crowds or planning everything in advance so that there are no unwelcome surprises. Both can have repetitive thoughts, obsessions, interests, or repetitive behaviours. Concentration and attention can be affected by intense thoughts or interests or memories, whether due to special interests or memories of a negative event. Differences in our attention and executive function also make concentrating on certain things very challenging. So, for example, I can maintain laser focus on complex mental problems for hours and hours, but 2 minutes of small talk and I'm already struggling to stay with it. Dissociation is a type of disconnection, like feeling that your body isn't really yours and that you're only really observing it from the outside. It may be a protective response to ongoing high levels of anxiety or distress, but there are also instances of autistic dissociation occurring without any trauma. I have a friend who described his childhood like watching life on TV. It just wasn't quite real somehow. And another who remembers people talking to her as a child, but she never talked back. She just didn't realise that she was part of the show, that she was supposed to participate in life that was going on in front of her. So as you can see, there's a huge overlap between PTSD symptoms and observable autistic behaviour. In fact, this is precisely why diagnosis based on behaviour can be so inconsistent and why diagnostic overshadowing, where PTSD symptoms are dismissed as just autistic behaviour or vice versa, can be such a huge problem. Correct and or unhelpful diagnoses can be extremely damaging for autistic people, especially late identified autistic women who may receive half a dozen different diagnostic labels but no effective help. We know that behaviour is only a symptom, so to be helpful we need to look deeper to what is causing the behaviour in the first place. It's cause a lot of stress. We also know that our body, specifically our autonomic nervous system, responds to stress in a certain way. We literally call it a stress response. When in this heightened state, our ability to relax, to socialise, to connect, and even to communicate with the people around us is dramatically reduced. Stephen Porges' Polyvagal Theory describes this phenomenon exceptionally well. It's a natural survival strategy designed to help keep us alive in the face of danger, something that could kill us. We need to react and respond straight away. No time to stop and think about our feelings, just run. Right now, your life is in danger.
Things. In order to put you in a flight or fight state, or an immobilized state, or a nice parasympathetic state, it has to be able to control your HPA axis, your hypothalamus, pituitary, adrenals. These are issues people have on the spectrum all the time. They're in flight or fight 24/7. And so it makes sense when you look at the vagus nerve that it's always on. And it's not hijacking this stuff, it's just using it in a certain way. Oxytocin we give to people in pill form because it helps calm them down, but it's actually something we make in the body when our body's in a good enough place. And it allows social behaviour bonding and relaxation. The kidneys produce vitamin D, which allows for mood, immunity, digestion of proteins, allows for cellular activity. The kidneys are the adrenals. If your kidneys are on 24/7, you don't have the downtime to make your vitamin D. And so many people on the spectrum are low in vitamin D. It's very, very common. But this makes sense of why. Because the body is never at a point of rest even when people are sleeping. And if you've got people on the spectrum or you are on the spectrum, you'll probably know that this is true. People don't wake up looking refreshed. And they're very alert all of the time. They can't get their brain to shut down. That's because the brain is constantly sending danger signals up to the brain to keep everything on, and so you're in this loop. Gallbladder and colon is influenced. Gallbladder does cholesterol and fats, so it to me makes sense of why people have issues around that. It's also you don't have as much feeling if you're in an immobilized state and that lion gets too close. So you often don't know when you're full, or you don't know when you have pain. So a lot of weight issues can be explained by this inability to have interoceptive capacity. Colon and bladder makes, a lot of sense to a lot of people. People have a lot of time trying to control this. And again, we do a lot of intellectual stuff around this. But what I find a lot of the time is when people get their body into a better place, this stuff kicks in. And they have this awareness, this interoceptive capacity that you can't take someone to intellectually. But it just is natural and naturally comes online when we are appropriately kind to the body. The gut does B12, serotonin, dopamine. It's 80 to 90% of the immune system's in the gut. And myelin, although it's not made in the gut, requires nutrients from the gut in order to be made. So B12 allows us to know who we are. It allows us to sleep well. It allows us to have good brain function. Myelin protects the nerves and helps you feel safe and resilient. And the new vagus nerve, the parasympathetic aspect of the vagus nerve, is highly myelinated. So at a physiological level, if you don't have a lot of myelin because you haven't been able to make it for like 10 years or more, or you haven't since you're a baby, it's very hard to have a good physiological capacity to be resilient. So what I see is the more we get the body into a good place, all of this stuff starts sorting itself out quite naturally. When you look at serotonin, which is produced in the gut primarily, it allows for deep peaceful states. It regulates intestinal movements and appetite and all of these things beautifully. If you don't have it, you have issues with mood, anxiety, and psychosis. And so we give people serotonin. But we make it in our body if our body's in a good enough place. And then our body knows how much we need. And it's cyclical. So when you have deep, peaceful states and you can heal and you can be in a good place, you keep doing it because you're sort of getting a nice spiral to a place of wellness. Dopamine allows for all of this stuff: excitement, reinforcement and reward, executive functioning, cognitive flexibility, motor control, motivation, etc. All this stuff, eyes. It's synthesized in the brain and the kidneys. So again, if we're really, really busy, it doesn't get to happen. So we're starting to understand just how much our emotional and physical capacity has to do with the state of our body. And we can put as much good food in and as much vitamins as we want, and that can sometimes be really useful. It doesn't always help. And I think because the nervous system's just running full tilt all of the time, and unless you educate it to sit somewhere differently, you often don't get a whole lot of change. So in a good place, the digestive system is on, and in a completely switched off place, it's seized. And people sit anywhere along here on any given day. But I just did a session with someone today, and I just was showing the mum how to do the exercise so that the kid could watch and get a feel for it without having to do it, and it's a much gentler way to start these things. And she found that her tummy just fully relaxed, and it was almost an unusual sensation for her, except she knows what that feels like. But it was quite swift and nice for her because her head got clear and she felt a whole lot better. But in that process, it was kind of interesting as well. It was very delicate, gentle exercise. But it's, I guess what I'm saying is we're playing with this very ordinary stuff, but it's also not ordinary if your tummy's always been seized and then suddenly it isn't. So we have to go very gently and thoughtfully. Lastly, the vagus nerve is in the gut and other organs. Since 80% of sensory information is afferent, which means it goes up to the brain. We always think things are the other way around and the brain's informing all the time. It actually isn't. All of your sensory info goes to your tummy first. And so all of that old adage of gut knowledge is actually true. When we're finding that out more and more and more as we're able to investigate the body with more sophisticated techniques. So when information comes in and you've got a very distressed system because it's been distressed since birth, it reads in a certain way, and anything is kind of read as noxious, more or less. And then it goes up to the brain, and then you get this loop of everything's not good, and it keeps the ears turned in a certain way so that you can't take in sound, your eyes stay fixed, etc., etc. And so people live in this loop. And all we're trying to do really is retrain the body to read sensory information so that information can come in and it doesn't tripwire the system and make it go offline. And it is surprisingly simple to do. As much as I'm weaving caution into all of my slides because I think it matters, and we can get very gung-ho, at the other end of it, done well, it's surprisingly efficient because the body knows what it wants and it likes feeling better. So we can teach people to feel like this, people on the spectrum, and it's easy, but we also can teach ourselves because everybody has a body. Everyone is well aware of when their body goes into that space. If you think about yourself in grief or shock, you bang into things, you don't want to eat, you can't talk, you can't handle light, etc., too much noise, you shut down a bit to protect yourself while your whole neurophysiology is adapting to the external event. And in many ways, what's happening for people on the spectrum is that their bodies are constantly in that space that it's been normalized. And it's a very interesting thing to show them, and it's very beautiful, and I cry all the time, all the time, because you are taking them to this entirely new place where they get to feel good, and it's stunning. Lastly, sorry, I'll chuck this in at the end because I think it's really important. What we're doing with this work is unlearning. We're employing all of these aspects of brain plasticity, and these are from Nanette Banyel's 9 Essentials, where we have to be highly individual with how we're working with someone, and we do engage their cognitive capacity, and we do engage them, and they're very much front and center of the work, and it has to be meaningful to people, and they have to want to do it. You can't tell someone to go to that place or have a checklist and they've got there by the end of 4 sessions or 50 sessions or something. Sometimes it takes 1 session and sometimes it takes a lot longer, but it's highly individual. And so these are some images from my book. We have to be very attentive to the body and very thoughtful. And then if we can manage that and know exactly what we're playing with, we get some wonderful results. We can take people out of a flight or fight or an immobilized state and back into their body so that they get to feel it and mobilize it and use it in a way that is far more comfortable and pleasant to be in. And then the world gets this amazing brain because there's a choice of when they can apply it more fully. And there's every chance it's an evolutionary upgrade.
In that sense, one way to think about a stress disorder is a little bit like an autoimmune disease. The functions of our body that are designed to keep us safe and healthy are working in overdrive, causing massive problems. In the case of autism, our differences also mean we find it difficult to socialize, to connect, and to communicate with most people. So we may already exhibit these behaviors even without any stress or trauma. And now for the elephant in the room that we haven't talked about yet. On top of everything we've discussed so far, the autistic experience of living in a world that wasn't designed for us means that a lot of us are also highly stressed and anxious. If shaking hands is enough to overwhelm your ability to cope, for example, then living in a world where people regularly expect you to shake hands and don't understand when you try to say no is extremely stressful and anxiety-producing, leading to the heightened stress response and associated symptoms we discussed earlier.
Happy to have you here. Welcome, Holly, and I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you for having me. It's nice to see you again. Thanks, Valenza. So yeah, this is my work. This is my book, which I wrote. I don't know, about 8 years ago or something now, a little while ago, and I wrote it because there was this wonderful theory, and I got really excited about it because it made such amazing sense to me, and no one was really much talking about it. So I couldn't help myself. I just had to put something together, and so it's really gone from there. I've got, as Valenza said, I have an award from the National Disability Service here in Western Australia for my work, and it's kind of quite different to what other people are doing. And so I'll give you a small gist of that as we go. So this is just me. And then this is, no, that's not. So yeah, so being me, I've considered myself on the autism spectrum. I wrote this book because I got really excited about what the possibilities for therapy for people and explaining autism in a way that was far more interesting and useful than anything I'd really read before. And so a whole lot of things click-clacked together for me and made a whole lot of sense. And then after I wrote the book, I went and worked in autism services for a number of years and got a really good gist of how things are run and what people are doing with a wide range of people. And I just, with all my experience with brain plasticity and all sorts of things I've learned in my, past life, I just knew there was something more interesting to do. So for me, there's a really long history of the way that we work with autism, and it's based very heavily in some pretty outmoded ideas about what autism is. And so while there's a lot of evidence-based practice, there's a lot of criticism these days for the kind of work people are doing for people on the spectrum, from autism advocates worldwide and from people who've grown up in the system and are challenging the dominant ideology with autism therapy. And this, I drew this picture because it's like the Stephen Covey 7 principles of success, or whatever it's called. I think I've got it in the next slide, where everyone's so used to cutting through the undergrowth and working their way through things and doing as you're supposed to be doing because that's what's done. And it has 30, 40, 50 years of research telling you why. And then there's policies and manuals and all this justification. However, times change and things move, and they have in the autism field very much in terms of advocacy, as I said, but also we've learnt a lot in the last 20 years on brain plasticity and body cognition and body psychology, that it really is time that we upgraded to something different. And so that's, that's what I see my role was as writing the book, is to sort of start to bring awareness of that. But then what I did was created a therapy that I'm so excited about and so delighted about. So I'll share a little bit more about that with you. This is what it looks like in practice, my work. It's really gentle work. It's working physically with people, but it's got quite a different slant to the regular OT and the regular speech kind of work. So I'm hoping you'll get an idea of that, mostly from going through the Polyvagal Theory and the vagus nerve, and then what that means. So usually we look at autism in terms of deficits and things people can't do, and then we try and manage that as best we can. And we don't see a lot of room for change, and we don't see a lot of room for progress, and we don't also describe a lot of beauty. Like when you look at Leo Kanner and Hans Asperger, who were writing about this, quite a long time ago now, they had special abilities at the top of their list for people on the spectrum. And now it's very diminished into something that's really deficit oriented. So there's a lot of scope there. And also, if you're working with people and you have a deficit model, I don't think you can get very far. There's a real glass ceiling for what you think you can have, and then what you're allowing to be changed and challenged within the therapeutic setting. We know from all sorts of things that we have done with people on the spectrum that physical stuff works. It calms people, it soothes people. We know that foods and taking care of diet and being sensitive to that helps, but we never really have an explanation of why. It's just, oh, that's autism. So we're sort of always playing with this very nebulous thing called autism that we don't know, we can't define. There's no part of the brain that's got autism. It's this very elusive kind of thing. Sorry for that's terrible language. And so all we've been able to do is say what it isn't, in a sense. But we know that physical therapies are useful. Aside from physical therapies, we do cognitive behaviour management very often, and so we teach people how to manage themselves and how to think and how to operate in a world that they don't particularly understand or particularly relate to. And we teach strategies like zone red, zone yellow, etc., to try and explain to someone with this deficit how to cope. The trouble is, a lot of people I see and speak to say, I get these strategies, I understand it, it's just I can't apply it when things go haywire. I can't stop myself going into that place. So while it can be explained like this, it's not really something that I can use. And so there's sort of this disparity between the intelligence of the person and sometimes the strategies that we're teaching and employing. And also these cognitive kind of therapies are very focused on behaviour and outcomes and how we are to other people and self-management.
Exactly.
Which, again, implies deficit. And it's also not about your well-being. It's about other people, and it's about fitting in enough.
Yeah.
And while that isn't a bad thing, I think we can expand what we're doing for people so that there's a more holistic way.
Yep.
Also, it's very intellectual to do that kind of stuff. And so it's quite difficult, not because people are stupid, because they're not, they're really, really smart, but they often have difficulty accessing their executive functioning and they have difficulty accessing their working memory. And because anxiety is very much a body state as opposed to a mental state. When you go into anxiety, your body has gone there first and it actually hijacks your brain. So it's very, very challenging for people to kind of access their body in order to regulate it, which is what you essentially have to do. 10% of us is intellect and 90% of us is autonomic, which means that our bodies operate without us being in charge of them, so we can be efficient and get on with our day. The difficulty is that people on the spectrum often have an autonomic system that's running away with them and they can't really control it. So they're often in flight or fight, or they're often in an immobilized state. And so what happens when we do these cognitive-based therapies, often enough, is that they fail because what you're asking someone to do is a really challenging configuration for them. So I'll have people that come to me and they're at uni and they are really, really bright, but they go, all the stuff that I've been asked to do, different therapies, I can't do them and I still can't leave the house and I'm still miserable and I'm really depressed and et cetera, but they feel like they failed. Whereas my challenge is perhaps the therapies are failing these people instead.
Especially when you are autistic and on top of that you have developed PTSD. The cell danger response healing cycle and chronic disease. Dr. Robert Naviaux.
Okay, what causes chronic disease? I'll say it's actually the failure to heal. So this is a bizarre tautology that I'll say. People are sick because they can't get better. Right? So you break a leg, we put a cast on the leg to support healing. After 6 weeks, we'll take that cast off. The initially atrophic muscles will re-strengthen, and after perhaps another 6 weeks, the point of break in a leg fracture will be stronger than it was before the fracture. Okay, but there's no longer a need to continue with the cast. Okay. So chronic, I'll make a statement that chronic disease is an actively maintained reaction to injury, not like a scab or wound that will not heal. A disease that is left behind, the disease that is left behind is not the initial injury. And it's very easy to be confused by this. Okay, very easy. So it doesn't do any good to put sunscreen on a melanoma. Okay? It doesn't do any good to wish that your child did not receive as many head traumas playing football or soccer in high school that might lead to an increased susceptibility to post-traumatic stress disorder later on from the military. Okay? You have to think about ongoing processes that create risk and maintain illness. So, why are more people getting sick? Well, the environment is becoming increasingly toxic, and this is something we are spending a lot of time in the lab developing advanced technologies to measure our food chain, water, air, and actually a variety of different biological samples as well to measure existing toxic burdens. Why do people stay chronically ill? They can't heal. Why can't they heal? And I'll say in most cases, it's because the healing cycle is blocked. Okay, salogenesis is blocked. Okay, but it can also be continuously re-injured. That's another thing. So if you cut your finger and every day you reopen it, okay, it's going to eventually scar, and it'll take a lot longer to heal. But it turns out that in order to heal, we actually have to proceed through a biologically determined ontogenetic sequence. Okay, this is something we inherited from our ancestors. As all life on the planet actually has to heal in a similar way. Moving from beginning to middle to end, I call these the cell danger response 1, 2, and 3 stages. This is an absolutely fundamental concept. We will not be successful as a community until physicians around the world know the difference, that the path that leads you to disease is not the path that leads you back to health. Okay? It's the path, so that the path that leads you to disease, we can provide symptomatic relief for, and that can be absolutely life-saving at times, but it will not activate the pathways of healing. Okay. All right, so to say this in a different way, a lot of what I do in science is stumble around, kind of like a child's game where you put on a blindfold, turn around, and take a step in one direction. That step is an experiment that we do, where we're asking a question of nature. Okay? And nature will say hotter or colder. Okay? And if we get the answer, we're moving in the right direction, then we take another step in that direction. This pathway is guaranteed to result in discoveries in medicine and science, because it is tapping into the source of all information that energizes and maintains life on our planet and throughout the universe. Okay, so we've spent a lot of time in this field of pathogenesis. And I'm going to talk a little bit about etymology because it'll be important for later. So pathos is Greek for suffering or illness or abnormality. Okay? There are literally thousands of agents. And we can direct drugs to specific pathogenetic processes. Okay? But those do not help with facilitating progress through the healing cycle. They just can help to prevent re-injury, okay, and stress. So, in order to, when you're an explorer and you're studying something new, many times we find that we do not have the words to describe what we see. Okay? Okay? These are just facts on the ground. They're observations that are being made of a new land that we've discovered because we've landed in a territory nobody else has been in before. Okay? All right. So, the Roman goddess of personal health and well-being was a goddess named Salus. Okay, I'm bringing this up because of etymology. Okay, so we talk about pathogenesis as the creation of disease. We need a term that will help us describe this phenomenon of what Leah actually talked about. She talked about it as health forming. Okay, but salogenesis is a new term. I don't know that it'll catch on, but it is, instead of looking for pathogens, we'll start looking for salogens, things that help bring about the restoration of health through a discrete knowledge, an absolute knowledge of the molecular systems biology of this progress of healing through beginning, middle, and end stages. All right. So it turns out, although there can be thousands of different pathogens, and before the microscope, we didn't know that bacteria existed, so you couldn't be a microbiologist, okay? And we couldn't know about the importance of the microbiome until we gave it a name, okay? So this is one way of studying the process that generates health, okay? And it's highly conserved evolutionarily. It is a choreographed ontogenetic sequence that has common bottlenecks, quality control steps, and delay mechanisms that are not unlike kind of secondary ecological succession, where there's a patch of land in the rainforest that might be burned, and then that patch has to be recovered, okay, and reclaimed by the rainforest. All right. So studies of pathogenesis will lead to treatments that produce palliation. Okay? So that's like insulin can be used to treat diabetes, but it never cures diabetes. Statins can be used to treat dyslipidemia, but never cure dyslipidemia. Okay? Antihistamines can be used to treat allergies, but they never cure an allergy. Okay? I could go on and on and on, because it actually is all of traditional medicine. Okay? This is the way that we deal with symptoms, is we create engineering solutions for acute symptoms. Okay? And they can be life-saving when there's an exacerbation of those acute symptoms. Okay? So this is not to cast aspersions on our toolbox of medicines that we have today. It's a call to begin a search and begin to train our pharmaceutical chemists that there is an entirely new class of drugs yet to be discovered, okay, that are salogens. Okay? All right. So the use of, so like there's pathophysiology, there's, physiology, there's, you can go on and on about this. But anyway, these treatments are designed to lead to recovery. And by recovery, I mean a return to a baseline state of vibrant health.
And what I'm seeing in the work I'm doing is that they are improving dramatically and rapidly in the ways that they want to by working with the body instead of cognitive focused therapies. So we know that autism is about the body. We also know that people with autism have gut problems, digestion, taste, food intolerances, sensory issues, vestibular proprioception issues, touch issues, pain intolerance. All this is very body oriented as well. And we don't really, again, have a really good reason for why. And then what we do is we individually deal with all of these issues and manage them at best and sort of go, again, well, that's just autism. But there's no sort of foundational way of understanding all of this and then directing our therapies, in a sense, to something that may be more cohesive. As people get older, there's all sorts of other things that go on at a body level. because even depression and anxiety, when you look at it, are just quite different now, we're finding, from what we used to say is a brain disorder with depression and etc. We're finding that it's just a massive, consistent overload for the system, and people get overwhelmed and just stay there and go into shutdown. And you'll see what I mean in a minute. But again, there's all these physical aspects to living in an autistic body or having an autistic mind that we don't really fully understand, because we've labelled it a brain pathology. So there's this huge gap between what's going on in the body and then the intellectual work that we're asking people to do. And I've found that it's very well met by this theory. The theory is by a chap called Stephen Porges. He's an American neurobiologist, and he's brilliant. He's loved worldwide for this theory that's probably about 25 odd years old now. And it's a way of talking about how the brain and body interact and what happens when the brain and the body stop talking to each other. And so this theory is applied to trauma, to bipolar disorder, borderline personality disorder, depression, anxiety, a whole range of things. And there was a very small portion in this very challenging book about autism, and it just thrilled me. So I wrote the Dr. Zeus version of it, and Steve Porges was very kind and wrote the foreword to my book. And he has also since had a look at my work, and he's been really complimentary about that, which has been really nice.
Foreword by Stephen Porges. In the academic research community, autism is discussed as a brain disorder with a genetic basis. Yet, no specific biomarker can diagnose autism. While the research community is focused on identifying specific mechanisms underlying autism, families are searching for an understanding of the disorder that will enable them to manage their child and to develop a strategy to optimize their child's potential. In response to this disparate agenda, Holly Brideges has written Reframe Your Thinking Around Autism. This is a succinctly written book with engaging graphics that provides a new, optimistic approach to conceptualize autism. Rather than focusing on the clinical diagnostic tools that have been used to define autism, Holly Brideges focuses on linking many of the compromised functions that are experienced by autistics to features of the Polyvagal Theory, a theory I developed. She accurately notes that the features of the social engagement system described in the theory are depressed in autistics. A depressed social engagement system results in poor facial affects, auditory hypersensitivities, lack of prosody in voice, and an autonomic state that under challenge will shift to support fight-flight behaviors or shutdown. This disruption in autonomic state would interfere both with ingestive and digestive processes. Using the Polyvagal Theory as an organizing principle, she introduces a variety of intervention models that potentially could function as neural exercises, brain plasticity, to rehabilitate the social engagement system and to optimize autonomic regulation. Unlike most books on autism that are targeted to professionals who evaluate and treat, This unique and readable book effectively connects to the families and the people who directly interact with individuals with autism. Stephen Porges, Ph.D., Professor of Psychiatry, University of North Carolina, and author of The Polyvagal Theory, Neurophysiological Foundation of Emotions, Attachment, Communication, and Self-Regulation.
But it's a really well-loved book because it is, when people read it, they just go, well, that makes so much sense.